It's Huluween on Disney+. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney+.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Huluween on Disney+. All these and more streaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney+. Bundle subscription required. 18+. Select Hulu content via Disney+. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
You don't technically need this car. You say that out loud to yourself. You say, I have no space. You say, I'm just looking. Then you click. Then you zoom in on photo number 87 and whisper, oh no. Then you text a friend, the one who always enables you. You say to yourself, this is the last one, knowing it is not. You don't need this car. But maybe, just maybe, this car needs you. Bring a trailer. It's never just a car.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. The Great Illegals Part 2, The Ambassador.
It's the morning of April the 27th, 1953, and the communist leader of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito, is receiving a diplomat at his White Palace in Belgrade.
In a simply furnished room, in the depths of a grand palace, two politicians greet one another with firm handshakes before sitting down. Though the room may be humble, our host is anything but. Tito is Yugoslavia's president, prime minister, army marshal, and godfather to every 9th child born in the country. And he has grand ambitions for his country. That's what today is about.
The meeting is with Teodoro Castro. He's the ambassador of Costa Rica. And it's one more small meeting in Tito's plan to create a bridge between the communist and the capitalist worlds.
At this moment, the relationship between East and West has never been so fraught. A bitter proxy war rages in Korea. The lines of the Cold War have been drawn, an Iron Curtain already descended. And yet here is Tito, making overtures to foreign diplomats.
He's a communist leader, but he's fallen out terribly with Joseph Stalin and is trying to create the path of an independent communist state.
And so Tito is on the charm offensive.
At the meeting with Teodoro Castro, the pair exchanged pleasantries, they joked, they talked about potential trade between their two countries.
Both of them smoke pipes with a cigarette tucked vertically into the end. The guest mimicking the Yugoslav leader's signature style out of respect. It appears the Costa Rican also knows a thing or two about charm offensives.
Castro asked Tito about his vision for Yugoslavia, and he name-dropped his connections in Rome and the Vatican.
If anything, the Costa Rican might be laying it on a little thick. At the end of their meeting, Tito remarks to his aides that while the ambassador was likable enough, he obviously had an ulterior motive for the meeting.
He thinks he's seen through the jokes and the silver-tongued flattery. He thinks this was a pretty transparent attempt to talk him into a favorable trade agreement for the Costa Rican.
Tito is right to suspect duplicity, and yet on all else, he is way wide of the mark.
So the man Tito was meeting really was a real accredited Costa Rican diplomat. But his real name wasn't Teodoro Castro, and he'd never even been to Costa Rica. His real name was Iosif Grigulevich.
Tito has spent the last half hour exchanging pleasantries with one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished deep-cover illegals, a spy who has received his orders directly from the top.
A few months before this meeting, Joseph Stalin had given Grigulevich an important and highly secret mission.
Grigulevich wasn't there to sign an economic deal with Tito. He was there to kill him. In the first part of The Great Illegals, you met Shaun Walker, a journalist and author who has spent the past decade researching Russia's legendary deep-cover spy program. The resulting book, entitled The Illegals, is a treasure trove of espionage capers, spanning the past century of Russian history. Dozens of highly trained and motivated agents flit through its pages, wreaking havoc both grand and small. And yet there are perhaps none so successful, nor so committed, as the true spy you are about to meet.
So Iosif is a kind of really interesting bridge character in the century of the Illegals program, because he's the last one in this mold of the earliest Illegals, who are these people who grew up in different countries, imbibing different cultures, working in the underground, and who could carry out these daring, flamboyant missions like he did.
By Shaun Walker's estimation, he is the very last of the so-called Great Illegals. It's time to get to know Iosif Grigulevich.
Iosif Grigulevich was born in 1913 in the Lithuanian city of Trakai.
Iosif's mother was Russian. His father belonged to the Karaim, a small ethnic group that practiced Judaism.
He grew up in Vilno, which would later become Vilnius, and became active in the communist underground during his teens.
As a result of that activity, Iosif was expelled from school and even spent time in jail. As soon as he could, he fled Lithuania, first for Warsaw and then for Paris,
where he met Polish revolutionaries and possibly also made his first contact with Soviet intelligence.
By this time, Iosif's father had emigrated to Argentina, where he was running a pharmacy near Buenos Aires. Iosif soon followed him out there.
While he lived in Argentina, Iosif became involved in the Argentinian communist underground, and he learned almost flawless Spanish.
A skill he would put to good use when, in 1936, he traveled back to Europe and volunteered to help the Soviet-sponsored communists in the Spanish Civil War.
He was hired as a translator by the NKVD, Stalin's secret service, and he was gradually given more and more important operations.
In this young, enthusiastic communist, the NKVD recognized a raw talent. A chameleon able to insinuate himself into all manner of situations.
Iosif had wavy, dark hair, which was often slicked back with gel, sparkling brown eyes, and an immaculate dress sense.
Despite having been born in Lithuania, Iosif could already pass as a Latino without challenge. On top of that, he was gifted with natural charm and charisma. But make no mistake,
underneath these suave, charming looks, there lurked the steely soul of a true believer and a ruthless revolutionary. Iosif's files from the time of the Spanish Civil War show that he was personally involved in long and often violent interrogations, as well as what the Soviets called the liquidation of enemies.
And so Iosif emerged from the Spanish Civil War as a prized asset, a reputation that would serve him well over the tumultuous period that followed.
So in 1937, Stalin launches a series of brutal repressions, which become known as the Great Terror, purging the leadership of factories, government departments, almost every Soviet institution, because he believes that they're filled with secretly disguised wreckers and enemies of the Soviet state, essentially capitalist illegals working as secretly inside the Soviet Union as his illegals work in the West.
It is worth noting that this was pure paranoia on Stalin's part. The West never came close to replicating the successes of the Soviet illegals program.
Unfortunately for the Soviet illegals, they're some of the first to be suspected in the purges because they've traveled the world, they do have foreign contacts, they've lived in the skin of capitalists. And many of the great early illegals who operated in Europe in the 1920s and early 1930s are called back to Moscow and shot.
It is partly because of these brutal purges, which laid waste to much of the NKVD's hard-won network, that Iosif climbs the ranks so quickly.
As a young communist at this time, he sails close to the edge. There's a couple of moments where he's a little bit in danger. People he's working with are called back and arrested, but he just about manages to survive and will go on to have a very long and fruitful career.
And so Iosif is well placed when Stalin turns the full energy of his vitriol to one evasive target. Long before Tito was a thorn in his side, there was the little matter of one Leon Trotsky.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Hey folks, get ready for a new season of Blowback coming Monday, September 22nd. This time around, we're covering the Cold War showdown in Africa.
When apartheid South Africa invades the newly independent nation of Angola, revolutionary Cuba sends its own army to defend its African ally, while the United States backs a warlord whose only goal is power.
Subscribe now at blowback.show and get the entire season when it drops, ad-free. Blowback.show.
So the arch villain during the purges is someone who's actually left the Soviet Union, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky had vied with Stalin after the death of Lenin for the mantle of heir to the Soviet Revolution, and he'd lost. Stalin, of course, had won and set about removing any potential rivals. Trotsky was pushed into exile. He moved around from Central Asia to Turkey to Norway and eventually ended up in Mexico.
In Mexico City, the erstwhile Bolshevik has gathered around him a cohort of leftist intellectuals and artists.
Stalin, by this point, was extremely paranoid, and he couldn't tolerate the idea that his arch-rival was living peacefully in Mexico, where he was penning diatribes slamming the way that Stalin's policies had supposedly ruined the socialist state. So he was determined that along with the bloodletting inside the country, he wanted to ensure that his spies were able to travel to Mexico City and kill Trotsky.
And the spy entrusted with that task is none other than Iosif Grigulevich.
So Iosif travels to Mexico, and he's appointed the head of an assassination squad that's going to gain entry to Trotsky's compound in Mexico City and kill him. He poses to the rest of the group as a Frenchman called Felipe.
Iosif introduces a Gallic twang to his perfect Spanish and keeps his true identity obscure from even his closest co-conspirators.
Together with the Mexican painter and ardent Stalinist David Siqueiros, they train up a team of assassins. And Iosif also makes friends with a young American who works at Trotsky's villa as a security guard, Robert Sheldon Hart.
Iosif is almost surprised by how easily his plan comes together.
So one night in May 1940, Grigulevich and the gang dress themselves in police uniforms and approach Trotsky's mansion. They disarm some of the security guards, and Robert Sheldon Hart then opens the gate for his friend in what appears to have been a prearranged agreement. Iosif and the other men ran into the compound, burst towards Trotsky's bedroom, and started firing gunshots at will as Trotsky and his terrified wife hid under the bed.
It would be the perfect assassination, were it not for one minor detail.
Miraculously, Trotsky and his wife emerged unharmed.
This botched near miss marked a first failure in Iosif's career as a spy.
It was so strange that the men had managed to get into Trotsky's house but failed to kill him that for a while the Mexican police thought it might have been a setup arranged by Trotsky himself.
But if Iosif had bungled the hit, he had, at least, made a more thorough job of the escape.
By the time the Mexican police inspector who was leading the investigation managed to find the safe house a mile away from Trotsky's home where Iosif had lived, all that was left was some luxurious underwear purchased in Paris.
Underwear that bore the name tag of Felipe, the Frenchman. For the rest of the story of Trotsky's assassination, take a listen to the True Spies episode, The Lover, the Axe, and Leon Trotsky. But Iosif's botched role in the plot was over. He would find ample opportunity to restore his reputation as one of Stalin's most trusted spies in the years that followed.
During the Second World War, Iosif is based in Argentina, where he assembles a band of saboteurs from sailors and port workers. The squad develops time-delayed bombs, essentially, and places them inside warehouses and on ships that are being used to transport Chilean fertilizer to Nazi Germany for use in explosives.
After the war ends, Iosif is adrift once again, traveling round Latin America on NKVD assignments.
For the past few years, he's been using all kinds of different passports, American, Mexican, Chilean, most of them forged and used for a few months before he had to discard them.
All standard practice for a Soviet illegal. But in 1945, Iosif identifies a path towards a more watertight cover story, one that could see him truly distinguish himself as an undercover agent. It happens on a visit to Chile.
Iosif had recruited a Costa Rican writer who lived there, who was also the country's vice consul in Santiago. And so together, they decided to invent a story that they could take to the aging consul general.
The story went that Iosif was the illicit son of a landowner and coffee grower in Costa Rica. Born out of wedlock, he had been sent away as an infant. But now that his father had died, he felt pangs of patriotic longing.
Iosif, supposedly, was Teodoro Castro, this long-lost son who wanted to recover his Costa Rican roots and go back to the land of his father where he'd spent his earliest childhood.
Iosif's recruit, the Costa Rican writer, personally vouched for the legitimacy of Castro's claim.
So before long, Iosif had a genuine passport identifying him as Castro, as well as a letter of recommendation from the Consul General.
That identity would lay the foundation for all that followed. In the years after, Iosif would gradually build on his legend.
At the end of 1945, in Uruguay, Iosif married the woman he had fallen in love with.
In the Mexican communist, Laura Aguilar, Iosif found a revolutionary as committed to the cause as he. Even at their wedding ceremony, they acted in service of the mission.
Both of them used fake passports. He was Teodoro Castro from Costa Rica. She was Inelia Idalina de Puerto Neves of Uruguay.
After their marriage, Moscow dispatched the newlywed illegals to Brazil, where they were to continue biding their time and cultivating their backstory. But even Moscow could not account for the arrival of a very real tragedy.
They had a son in 1946, but the child was born with a heart defect and died 6 months later.
In the sadness that followed the loss of their first child, Iosif longed to return to the Soviet Union, to drop his act and know that he was safe among friends. And to his surprise, Moscow granted the couple permission to leave South America.
When they got there, at the end of 1947, they found a freezing, grey metropolis that was a shock to the system for both of them, especially Laura, who'd never left Latin America.
And so it doesn't take long for Iosif and Laura to begin dreaming of their next assignment, somewhere warm, where their hard-won cover identities can be wheeled out once again. And as fate would have it, the perfect destination for this ambitious couple is emerging from the rubble of World War II.
So this is the very beginning of the Cold War, where the communist and capitalist systems are starting to stand off against each other in Europe. And Italy is one of the key battlegrounds of this early confrontation. The defeated state was firmly inside the Western sphere of influence, but there was an incredibly strong local communist movement.
One that Moscow wanted to nurture in any way it could. To this end, Iosif and Laura were instructed to obtain tourist visas for Italy.
And they're sent off to Rome with the task of embedding themselves in the local business community, becoming essentially players about town, seeing what kind of connections they can make, what kind of useful sources they can develop on the ground in Rome.
In the Italian capital, Iosif deploys a version of the same cover story that won him his Costa Rican passport. He is Teodoro Castro, a wealthy Costa Rican businessman who has spent the majority of his life in Chile. He met his wife, Inelia, on holiday in Uruguay and moved to Brazil. Still recovering from the sudden death of their first child, they had traveled to Rome to seek a blessing from the Holy Father, and finding that the climate suited them, had decided to stay. It's a masterfully crafted cover story, weaving painful truths into the fiction, and it serves the couple well.
They begin, Iosif and Laura, by doing the rounds of the Latin American diplomats based in Rome. Iosif meets with Giulio Pacelli, who is a nephew of Pope Pius XII, and also one of his many roles was Costa Rica's representative to the Vatican, and he would eventually engineer meetings with the Pope for Iosif.
Despite never having been to Costa Rica, Iosif quickly establishes himself as an impassioned advocate for his supposed country of birth.
His big break comes in the autumn of 1950, when a group of Costa Rican dignitaries, including the former president José Figueres, visits Rome.
Iosif pulls out all of the stops to impress this delegation, winning them an audience with the Pope himself, and talking at length
about the potential huge business opportunities for Costa Rican coffee and other goods that he, Teodoro Castro, can help to facilitate in Italy.
Figueres and his delegation leave Rome utterly charmed.
A few months later, the country's ambassador to Spain, who also covers Italy, arrives and is given a meeting with the Pope by Iosif. And after this visit, he writes back to San Jose, the home capital, to say, this guy I've met in Rome is doing an incredible job of promoting our country's interests, and he recommends that Iosif be given a diplomatic rank so that he can formally represent Costa Rica.
It's an honor that Teodoro Castro, Costa Rican patriot, is only too happy to accept.
Iosif writes back to the Costa Rican Foreign Ministry that he is honored and delighted to be offered this role as a diplomat. He tells them that he's always retained spiritual ties with his homeland, even though he's lived abroad for so long.
Wasting no time, Iosif immediately begins inhabiting the role of the model diplomat.
He rents rooms for an embassy. He hires lavish ballrooms at fancy hotels where he throws grand receptions for the diplomatic corps and various dignitaries.
He tells the foreign ministry that he can foot the bill for all of this, thanks to his great successes as a businessman.
What they don't know, of course, is that the money is coming from Moscow.
Money that the centre is all too happy to spend. Never has an illegal so quickly and effectively fulfilled the mission of infiltrating the uppermost echelons of politics and society.
So an evaluation of Iosif by his spy masters in Moscow gives a good idea of the way he was operating in Rome. He's pleasant looking, has extravagant tastes, is always carefully and nicely dressed, is generous, can hold a conversation on any topic, and can tell funny jokes or stories that he often invents on the spot. This makes it easy for him to connect with people and makes him an excellent recruiter, either by persuading people to cooperate or using them without them even knowing.
That's an A+ report card directly from the centre. All other illegals take note. Must try harder. And all the while, Iosif's other employers are every bit as taken with him.
So Iosif is the rising star of the Costa Rican Foreign Ministry. And in November 1951, Iosif's invited to be part of the Costa Rican delegation to the 6th session of the relatively new United Nations, which is to be held at a palace in Paris.
While there, Iosif was put to work drafting speeches for Costa Rican diplomats and meeting representatives from the other assembled nations.
One evening in Paris, he was invited to the Yugoslav embassy, where it was discussed that perhaps Costa Rica and communist Yugoslavia could open diplomatic relations.
An idea that seems to please all present.
And eventually it was decided that who better to become accredited as the official representative of Costa Rica in Yugoslavia than their charming diplomat in Rome, Teodoro Castro.
So now, Iosif is officially accredited as Costa Rica's representative in both Italy and Yugoslavia. The web of his influence is expanding. And he has reached this position by using nothing more than the strength of his own instinct.
So as far as we know, Iosif had no particular mission to cultivate the Yugoslavs or to do any of the things he was doing. But he'd been told to make as many connections as he could in Rome, and he was fulfilling that mission incredibly successfully.
The feather in this charismatic diplomat's cap would arrive just months after that fateful UN session.
So in 1952, Iosif's wife Laura makes a trip to Costa Rica to go and meet his bosses in the foreign ministry personally. And they tell her that they're so happy with his work in Rome that they're going to promote him to the rank of full ambassador. A few months later, he is welcomed to the palace of the Italian president in a big ceremony where he officially gives his credentials.
It's a feat unmatched, at least as far as we know, by any other Soviet illegal. Iosif has been ushered into the fold of international power. It's difficult to overstate the scale of this victory.
So the Soviet Union has a large embassy in Rome. They have their own diplomats there. They have people who can send back reports to Moscow. But none of these Soviet diplomats have the access that Iosif has managed to gain as Costa Rican ambassador, because he can meet with the Pope, he can meet with the US ambassador, he can travel to Yugoslavia and meet with Tito.
Since Iosif's first meeting with the Yugoslav contingent at the United Nations, he has been busily consolidating his standing with the country.
So Iosif's first visit to Belgrade comes in July 1952, and it's set up by the Yugoslav ambassador to Rome, who he's, of course, become very good friends with. They have dinners with each other in Rome, and he has a series of good meetings in Belgrade. They discuss formalizing relations, doing a trade deal, and he's invited back to a reception in Tito's White Palace a few months later, where he will meet the leader himself.
When Iosif returns to Belgrade, he meets Tito for the very first time. The pair exchange pleasantries about Costa Rica before the Yugoslav leader moves on.
Iosif sends a long message back to Moscow detailing his meeting with Tito and his new access in Yugoslavia. And it's this message that starts the cogs turning in the Soviet intelligence machine.
The timing of this message is important. With Iosif's new platform and access as a fully fledged ambassador, come even greater risks for the illegal.
So there's one problem with Iosif's new life, and that's how public it is. Because many people knew Iosif Grigulevich as a revolutionary in the underground or in the Spanish Civil War. And there's a worry that now he's giving public lectures, he's appearing on the front page of Costa Rican newspapers, smiling with the Pope, that someone's going to recognize him. There's also a worry that as an ambassador, it's just not really compatible with the monthly trips he'd been taking, often to Vienna, to meet with Soviet representatives so he could debrief them and tell them what he's been up to.
Already, there is a sense that his incredible ascent cannot continue forever, and so the centre begins to wonder what the end game is here. How best to put Iosif's access and influence to use before it's too late. And in the serendipity of Iosif's new relationship with Yugoslavia, the perfect opportunity has miraculously presented itself. An opportunity to finally eliminate one of Stalin's fiercest enemies.
Tito is unique in the communist bloc because whereas most of the Eastern European communist regimes were helped into place by Stalin and the Soviet Union, Tito's partisans fought in the Second World War and independently came to power. And Tito felt that meant he should have free rein to develop the country as he wanted. And in 1948, this led to a big split between the two countries because Stalin couldn't tolerate a kind of another independent figure in the socialist bloc. And so this kind of deteriorates. It starts with mutual kind of insults and threats.
And it's not long before threats become actions. Stalin dispatches assassins. The assassins fail.
In 1949, Tito wrote an angry letter. Stalin, stop sending people to kill me. We've already captured 5 of them, one with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send one to Moscow.
After that letter, Tito purged thousands of Stalinists from his country and party and cut off all contact with the Soviet leader. With no spies remaining in Belgrade, Stalin was forced to watch as the Yugoslav leader launched his charm campaign on the West, cheapening the very principles of communism while safely out of the great leader's reach.
But then Iosif appears with his fantastic access, his already arranged possibilities to meet with Tito, and the idea of dealing with this problem once and for all again seems very attractive to the Soviet leader.
A few months after Iosif files his report on his meeting with Tito, he receives word that he's to attend an urgent in-person meeting with his NKVD bosses in Vienna. There, Iosif is finally brought into the fold.
Stalin had rejuvenated his plans to kill Tito, they told him, and he was in the perfect position to do so.
No record of the meeting survives, and so we can only speculate as to how the Costa Rican ambassador receives this assignment.
We don't know how Iosif reacted to what sounds a lot like a suicide mission, but he'd always been a loyal soldier, and even though for the past few years he'd got used to diplomatic receptions and cocktails, he, of course, had a long history of being an assassin for the Soviet state.
And besides, it's not like Iosif is offered any other option. This is his duty as a servant to the Soviet mission. Before Iosif returns to Rome, his superiors begin drawing up options for the assassination that Stalin is determined will happen.
In one, the idea was that Iosif, during a private audience with Tito, would release a dose of pulmonary plague into the air.
Iosif himself would be pre-vaccinated, but everyone else present would contract the lethal disease and die.
Another option suggested that Iosif could obtain an invite to a diplomatic reception for Tito during an upcoming visit to London. The document suggested that the terrorist act could be accomplished by shooting with a silent mechanism concealed as a personal item, while simultaneously releasing tear gas to create panic among the crowd.
A third option was the same plan, only in Belgrade instead of London.
And the final potential plan was to give Tito a gift in a jewelry box which would release a deadly poison when he opened it.
In all scenarios, Iosif would be expected to complete one crucial task before the hit.
In a sign that perhaps Moscow knew it was essentially sending Iosif to his death, he was to write a letter from Teodoro Castro to his wife, bidding her farewell and explaining that he had carried out the attack because he hated communism,
thereby deflecting attention away from the Soviet state. An outlandish set of options, perhaps. But then these were outlandish times.
So, a couple of weeks later, Stalin summons one of his top intelligence bosses, Pavel Sudoplatov, into the Kremlin and runs him through these options. And Sudoplatov, who is a veteran of this kind of mission, he's done extraordinarily audacious assassinations himself on Ukrainian nationalist figures, for one, in the 1930s. But he looks at these and he thinks it's mad, basically. He tells Stalin that, or at least he later claims that he told Stalin that all of these methods were childish and naive, and that the plot was dangerously incompetent.
But Stalin refused to hear him. The plot would proceed, he insisted, as soon as possible. And quite unbelievably, the winds of fate were about to deliver Iosif the perfect opportunity to press ahead.
So all of these options had been predicated on Iosif having to cunningly worm his way into a meeting with Tito in London or in Belgrade. But then something remarkable happens, which is that just recently Tito had changed the Yugoslav constitution, and he was now officially, as well as de facto, the head of state. And this meant that all of the ambassadors accredited in Yugoslavia had to re-present their credentials to the new head of state, Tito.
And so Teodoro Castro, as the Costa Rican ambassador to Yugoslavia, would be invited for a personal meeting with Tito in April of 1953.
So here we are, instead of having to tortuously work out how he's going to get an invite to the diplomatic reception in London or send a pleading letter asking for a meeting with Tito, he's being offered one without any work at all.
As Iosif accepted his invitation to Belgrade, he must have known that his chances of returning were diminishingly small.
Probably the best outcome he could hope for is the outcome of the man who eventually killed Trotsky after his failed attempt, Ramon Mercader, who more than a decade after was still rotting away in a Mexican prison.
But with the directive issued from Stalin himself, what choice did he have? Defection, perhaps? But that was never really on the table for a communist as committed as Iosif. Like the duty-bound soldier he had always been, Iosif accepted his fate.
So Iosif had gone back to Rome, and he was waiting patiently to find out which of these audacious assassination options had been chosen in Moscow. But when he does hear news from Moscow, it's not a coded message, it's not a secret missive. Instead, it's something that was all over the front pages of the Italian newspaper, the talk of Rome, the talk of the whole world.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
On March the 3rd, 1953, Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, died of a stroke.
As Soviet radio put it, the heart of Lenin's comrade in arms and the inspired continuer of Lenin's cause, the wise leader and teacher of the Communist Party and the Soviet people, has stopped beating.
With no succession plan in place, Stalin's death left Moscow in a state of chaos. That disorder filtered through to all aspects of the Soviet state, including its intelligence departments.
To what we have to assume was an enormous amount of relief on Iosif's part, the mission to kill Tito is put on hold when Stalin dies.
But Iosif still has an appointment to keep, which is how, just a few weeks after Stalin's death, the NKVD's most valuable illegal finds himself making the trip from Rome to Belgrade one last time.
So he sets out as planned to Belgrade in April 1953 to present his credentials to Tito, and instead of bringing with him a dose of powdered plague or a poisoned jewelry box, he packs what's now his standard diplomatic gift, a sack of the finest Costa Rican coffee.
The Yugoslav leader would never discover how close he came to death that day. But for Iosif Grigulevich, that meeting must have felt like a turning point in his career as an illegal. The near miss that announced the beginning of the end.
In some ways, this is the peak of Iosif's career as an illegal. He's meeting with Tito back in Rome, where there's an election campaign underway. He still has extraordinary access. The new US ambassador arrives in town, and one of the first people she meets is the Costa Rican ambassador. But at the same time, Iosif is tired. His wife is pregnant again, and they give birth to a baby in June 53. And he's worried that he's starting to make mistakes.
With the death of their first child still hanging over them like a shadow, the couple feel the incredible pressure of the life they have chosen. Iosif knows that he is living inside a house of cards. Cracks in his polished veneer begin to open up. On a train ride through Milan, Iosif realizes his suitcase has been stolen and wonders if he has become the target of counter-espionage. Then,
he makes a slip-up at a art exhibit when somebody asks him whether he likes the paintings, and out of nowhere, he says, "Niet." And then, he manages to recover it. He sort of says, "Oh, I believe that's how they say it in the homeland of the artist."
But Iosif knows his mask is slipping.
He's also worried, of course, because nobody quite knows what's going to follow Stalin's death.
Iosif had long been doggedly loyal to Lavrentiy Beria, the ruthless head of all the Soviet Union's secret services. So when Beria was summarily executed, in the power struggle following Stalin's death, Iosif feared the worst.
Perhaps there's going to be another purge of anyone seen as loyal to Beria.
So when the message arrived that Iosif and Laura should return to Moscow, Iosif must once again have wondered if he was being sent to his death. But the prospect of finally putting an end to his double life still came as a relief.
So he sends a note to the Costa Rican Foreign Ministry telling them that due to a delicate illness, his wife has to leave Rome and they're going to take some leave in Switzerland And in December 1953, they leave together for Vienna and then for Moscow.
In Moscow, Iosif evaded the brutal punishment that he had feared awaited him. Instead, he found himself facing a different kind of sentence.
Iosif goes back to Moscow. He's desperate to be sent back abroad. After he's had a bit of rest, he misses the undercover life. He begs the center to send him out somewhere. But they tell him, look, you're being ridiculous. There's way too many people who know you as Costa Rican ambassador Teodoro Castro. Your life as an illegal is over.
And so Iosif started a new life as a Soviet academic, specializing in Latin America.
And over the next 3 decades, he writes dozens of books, including a biography of David Siqueiros, the Mexican painter, which doesn't mention that the author had once led Siqueiros in a failed attempt to kill Trotsky.
When Iosif finally died in 1988, only a handful of those closest to him knew anything about his former life as an illegal.
And it's only in 1991 when the Soviet archives open a little bit and the extraordinary story of Iosif Grigulevich starts to seep out that the Costa Rican Foreign Ministry find out what on earth happened to their ambassador in Rome.
Though his story is still relatively unknown, for Shaun Walker, Iosif Grigulevich will always be the last of the great illegals. Even though the program has continued for the 70 years since his retirement, no Russian spy would ever again pull off such acrobatics of infiltration and influence.
Once we get into the Cold War period, both because the Soviet regime is much less risk-taking and because all of these cosmopolitan polyglots used to life in the underground no longer exist, or they've been shot by Stalin. The operatives are very different. And what we see is a change into a kind of illegals program where young, promising Soviet citizens are put in safe houses for years and trained painstakingly to take on an identity, sent abroad, and then often they're just there as sleepers because after all this training, the center is worried about burning them on anything risky. So this idea that Iosif could sort of wander around Rome, take on an ambassadorship, this is kind of the last time that something like this happens.
To uncover more fascinating stories from all eras of Russia's deep cover program, you can turn to Shaun Walker's book, The Illegals. And we'll be back next week with another secret briefing from True Spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
Agents are recruited for one reason, and that is they have access to secret information. When you join an organization like the Foreign Office, we do think a lot about their personality and their motivation, but it's not part of the selection process. So that is why we find ourselves very often with people who have secret information, are willing to share it, but they're not all the same. Everybody's motivation is different. And then it's the case handler's job to manage those differences. And he doesn't know if he's going to be dealing with a sociopath or a very greedy person or someone who's very timid and nervous. So we have to learn how to judge their personality and their motivation and to make that work.
True Spies, The Debrief from SPYSCAPE Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.